Happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's great to be joined here today by Stephen and Jay, my friends who live off over in Nob Hill off of Pacific. And I lived with them for a little bit and actually worked in District 3 over at the San Francisco Community Land Trust when it was located on Columbus Street. It's since moved over near Market and Hayes Valley area. How many people have heard of the San Francisco Community Land Trust? So that is a program that I was working in, where in a sense we're small property owners. We have I don't work there anymore, I was the operations manager, but we had a portfolio of about 13 properties. And so being someone who is a tenant advocate, but also had the experience of working in property management and tenant management, gives me an understanding of both sides in a way that is really valuable now. And Ellen Zhao is going to come and speak with you, and it might surprise you that my approach is really a collaborative leadership style. So I've already reached out to Ellen, and we had a meeting about a week and a half ago where we talked about some of the issues that we differ on. Because Ellen, I actually saw for the first time over in Sacramento when I was there about 2 weeks ago to support the repeal of Costa-Hawkins. Now, how many people know what Costa-Hawkins does? What it does is that it makes it so that cities don't have the ability to expand rent control on buildings that are built after 1979. And so that means if you live in a building built in 1980 or 1990 or 2000, your landlord at any moment could raise your rent $2,000 a month and you'd be out on the street and there's nothing you can do about it. And so Ellen was at the Capitol building in Sacramento, and I was there, and I do feel that stable rent is a human need. Because how can you really feel like you're part of a neighborhood or part of a city or live your life if you feel that at any moment you could be uprooted because of someone else's desire to raise the rent? But like I said, I also understand the needs of the property owners and that there needs to be this tenant management support and screening support, and especially for the thousands of elder Chinese property owners that are in District 3, many of whom have buildings that have vacant units in them. And why aren't they renting them out? Because they don't feel like they have the support for screening and tenant management. There's a language barrier when there's issues, because being a property owner and managing tenants is a messy business, right? It's human stuff. And so they don't have the support to do that. So Ellen was in Sacramento as well. And when I was in the hallway, there were about 500 or so people that were bussed in from the Small Property Owners Association from San Francisco, and there were about 300 people that were there as tenant rights activists. And at first, I ended up going down the line and saying stable rent is a human need to every single person, and just looked them in the eye that was there to oppose the repeal of Costa-Hawkins. But then I had the ability to talk with about 13 of the small property owners that were there, and that's when I realized we need to actually work together with small property owners in order to protect tenants staying in San Francisco, because if they sell to the 1% because for whatever reason they can't maintain their buildings or the allure of selling to the market, then what happens when they do that? So they sell to someone else, and then oftentimes there's an Ellis Act eviction and everybody gets displaced. And so that is just an example for you of the style of leadership that I have, where, and Ellen's here right now, that's the style of leadership that I have where I am a bridge builder. And I'm someone who has a design thinking approach, and that means that I'm not just looking at one particular stakeholder group when I'm trying to solve a problem. I'm looking at the whole system and thinking about how do we bolster and support the whole system, not just one side over the other. So after the election, I ended up using all of that momentum that I had, because 80,000 people voted for me personally first, second, or third place in that election. And I had a slew of ideas that weren't just ideas and platitudes that you're going to hear from the other candidates about how they're going to end homelessness and how they're going to build affordable housing. What's your plan? That's my background in organizational development, in program development, in evaluation and outcomes development. So what I'm trying to do is say, I want to take this concept of ending the tent encampments, and then I figure out a way to actually implement that. So I actually have a plan for how to do that kind of work. And when I do that work in terms of, I spent the last 2 years, I founded the St. Francis Homelessness Challenge. And my focus has been working with encampment residents and neighbors and the direct service workers on the street. How are we going to solve this crisis and address the service gaps that are there? So I have this outcomes over egos approach, and I kept, over the last 2 years, trying to work with everybody at City Hall to do this work. And how many people are frustrated with what City Hall is doing or not doing about tent encampments? Yeah, me too. Me too. But it's not just that I came in there and said, I'm critiquing you and I want this to stop. I actually have a background in transitional housing and mental health work and intentional communities and activating space. And so I have created a plan where we can actually transition 1,000 people off of the street into these transitional villages that are integrated into community, because we have to treat it like a crisis, that people are living on the street without access to a toilet and secure sleep and are getting traumatized. Yes, we have to build the affordable housing, and I have plans for how to do that as well, which are very exciting, but we also have to treat it like a crisis. And that's why it was so interesting to me to recently read this resiliency report. And the Rockefeller Foundation works with a bunch of different cities on, it's called the Resilient Cities Program. And one of the solutions that they pose for dealing with the aftermath of a crisis is villages. And so it's shocking to me that the city doesn't have this systems thinking approach where they're thinking about, in permaculture they call it stacking functions. Another way to call it is, connecting the dots. So how do we deal with one issue but also solve a slew of other issues at the same time? So I have been trying so hard to work to address this encampment crisis over the last 2 years. And it's interesting because I get calls from San Diego's City Council. I'm working on a regional group of safe organized spaces working groups to deal with the encampment crisis. I got calls from Seattle's City Council member, but my own City Hall and the Board of Supervisors won't work with me on this issue. And you know why? Because Ed Lee decided that they're not going to treat the encampment crisis like a crisis. They decided to instead institutionalize tent encampments by exiting people from the navigation centers and the hospitals and also the shelter programs back to the street. And we also have 1,000 people on this waiting list right now. So I do have a tangible, actionable plan. And when you have other candidates come here, ask them, what do you think of Amy's plan for transitional villages? And to be able to get 1,000 people off of the street into these spaces right now as a triage approach, which can actually benefit the community. Like I said, I have one pilot right now that I've been able, so I don't have access to resources or power in a certain way yet. Because if we all get together and say, we want these kinds of programs that Amy's proposing through her campaign to be pushed forward. We want the equity issues to be front and center. We don't want just another horse in the race type of thing. Who's your favorite horse? Oh, I love Leno. I love Kim. I love Alioto. Sure, I love London Breed. You can say that you like someone's record of leadership perhaps, but let's not even think about the individual with this. Let's put the issues first and redesign the track rather than just have a horse in the race. And so I'm going to pass these out. This is my cards that I have that have quite a few things on it that I'm developing actionable plans for. I've already developed actionable plans for some of them. Here you go. Thanks. And you can see on the top, it's on this side. So it says collaborative leadership for a fair share economy. So a public bank This is something that I've been advocating for in San Francisco since John Avalos brought it up in 2011. Any public bank fans in the house? All right, we got a few. And after the global financial collapse, which state was the one that wasn't affected? Which one state wasn't affected by the global financial collapse in the same way as the others?
North Dakota.
North Dakota. And why is that?
Because they had a public bank.
They have a public state bank, and so they weren't actually impacted by the risky investing practices of the commercial banking. So in San Francisco, we have a, how big of a budget? $10 billion budget this time around. $5 billion of it is in our general fund that we get to decide how to spend. And so we have the ability to have that money invested in a public bank that is safe, and the way that they're designing that right now is they just had a report from the Budget and Legislative Analyst Office, and they're going to have a task force that they're going to try to move forward with soon in order to implement that. And there's actually a hearing at City Hall on February 8th at 10 a.m. about the public bank, so you'll have the opportunity to hear more about that. So a public bank, is something that we should have invested in after the global financial collapse of 2008. There are a lot of things we should have done differently after 2008, but Ed Lee's Department of Economic and Workforce Development actually rolled out the carpet to Chase Bank in my neighborhood of Divisadero to displace 3 local businesses and bend the law to the point of breaking it. I looked at that law and it was broken. We have formula retail law, and I was shocked that after Chase Bank participated in our global financial collapse, they were being rewarded by Ed Lee's administration. The same thing along Market Street. These property owners had had their properties and had kept them vacant for many, many years, some of them. And instead of developing a vacancy tax and figuring out not just a stick to say if you keep your property vacant, you're going to get dinged this much, we have to have not just the stick, but also the support to be able to activate that space and to use it. But why is it that if you were a property owner along Market Street, you blighted our city for decades and caused these problems, and then you get to cash out because of the Twitter tax break? So, Jane Kim and Ed Lee decided that they were in, Gavin Newsom and David Chu, they decided they were going to invest in this Twitter tax break approach rather than a vacancy tax. There was a census done in 2010. I was actually in grad school at SF State at the time for organizational development, and I worked at the census during that time, and they found that there were about 30,000 units that were underutilized. Now, instead of doing, once again, a vacancy tax or an empty unit dwelling management program where we work with the property owners to screen and find people to be able to live there, like our workers, right? What happened? Ed Lee looked the other way and allowed Airbnb to take, and London Breed as well, to take thousands and thousands of units off of the market illegally through Airbnb. I was there. I was at the Planning Commission meetings. My organization that I started after the Chase Bank activism that I did was called Neighbors Developing Divisadero, because I realized it's not just enough to say no to things. We actually have to learn how to be developers and know the code. And it was my neighbors that taught me this formula retail law code and the zoning code, and I realized this isn't over my head. It just takes a while to acclimate yourself to it. And if we're going to protect our neighborhoods from displacement that is greed driven, then we're going to need to figure out how to develop in a way that supports equity and supports the whole community. So I got involved in that activism at the time. There's quite a few other things on this list here. Thousands of affordable units for workers and families. How do we do that? Here's something exciting. How many people here know about additional dwelling units? The term additional dwelling units. ADUs. And so what the city did back in 2015 when I ran the first time, this was an idea I put forward. Did any of you hear it? No, probably not. Why? Because the media said I didn't exist. I was an aberration of democracy. Why didn't they give these ideas the spotlight that they deserve? Because they actually could have really helped the city. So what the city did was they assessed all the properties and found that 37,000 properties in San Francisco can have an additional dwelling unit built within the building envelope, not like a granny unit outside of the building, but actually on floor space that's within the footprint of the building. 37,000 units. So what that means is that we have and now 2 years later, the city finally made it so that citywide we can build these additional dwelling units, and we can upzone in areas where they might be in RH1 zoning. You can actually add the additional unit without having to deal with that conditional use permitting process. So with that in mind, we could actually be developing thousands of units and working with the building trades and the small property owners to say, hey, you have the ability, and especially for marginalized communities, you have a property that can have an additional unit. We, the city, will provide you with a zero interest loan to be able, and the construction support and design support to be able to add this here. And then you don't have to pay anything if, while you're paying off that loan with the rent that comes in, you're renting to someone at 30% of their income, who's one of our teachers, workers, firefighters, these types of things, right? How many people have used the Dahlia system for MoCD? The Mayor's Office of Housing has something, now it's an online system called Dahlia, where you can actually sign up for a below market rate rental, and then there's a lottery program for it. So we already have a system in place now that we could use so if you're a worker or a teacher and you have to live in Oakland, let's say, you can't afford to live in San Francisco, or you're paying more than 50% of your rent or income towards rent, you could sign up on the Dahlia system, and then we could help place you in one of these units that we're building, right? And the great part about additional dwelling units is that they cost at max usually $200,000 per unit to build. Guess how much the going rate for a new unit to build in San Francisco is in a large development? $500,000 to $700,000, okay? So a public bank can also be used once we get it, because we won't have to pay the fees, and we actually get the interest from that to do this affordable housing development, which is really exciting. I've also been talking with people about different financing mechanisms, because the way that you develop housing right now, affordable housing, there's really two paths. One of them is market rate housing, where you have inclusionary. And Mark Leno actually was instrumental in working with San Francisco Housing Action Committee to do the inclusionary rates, decade ago. So that's one way. We can say 15% of, or 18% of this housing has to be affordable in this new development. Another way is we get tax credits, federal tax credits, but you can only use those tax credits, and it's very complicated, up to 60% AMI. So that means people earning up to about like $50,000 a year, $40,000 a year, something like that. So it limits it, and that makes it really hard, because we want to have a stratified amount of affordability within buildings, right? You don't want just up to 60%. In order for it to be economically feasible, we'd rather that it go this whole range of 15% AMI all the way up to 120, 140%, so the project can pencil out. But we need these new financing mechanisms. So I was just at Spur yesterday, and there was an expert about this that I talked to, and I said, well, how do we do this to get the financing so that we can build housing that is this whole gamut of income ranges? And he said, if you do that, you won't get the federal tax credits, but we could have a state tax credit where it would allow for the affordability to be added onto it. So these are the kinds of conversations that I have all the time, is not just this idea of we need to build more affordable housing. Don't accept that this time around. Don't accept it when a candidate tells you they just need to build more affordable housing. Ask them, well, what about this ADU plan? And what about a new financing mechanism? And how are we going to work with unions and their pension funds in order to support this? And is a public bank a good idea for this? I will go ahead and ask for questions now. I really focused it today on just diving into some of the issues, because believe it or not, people look at me and they dismiss me as being a mind that can actually lead this city because of this packaging, right? Because people see my 40-year-old female packaged self and they think, well, who is this lady and how can she actually lead this city? Well, I have the ability and the proven ability to be a collaborative leader. I'm a community organizer, and I'm a pragmatic visionary, because the things that I said in 2015, you can actually go and look them up, and they're the things that everybody's talking about now. But I wasn't just talking about them in this general way. I have a plan so that on June 6th, 2018, the day after the election, we can actually hit the ground running. Every candidate should tell you, what is your plan for June 6th about affordable housing? What is your plan about dealing with the encampment crisis? What is your plan for community integrated mental health? How are you going to make sure that that cannabis consumption is equitable and mindful, and that we create opportunity through it? What are the ways that you're going to lift all boats through this economy? So these are the things that I really implore you to ask the candidates about, rather than just accepting that I know that guy's name and he seems to have done some good things in the past. So with that, I will go ahead and open it up to any questions, and we have just a couple minutes maybe. Okay, great, yeah.
I voted for you in 2015.
Thank you.
We were one of the 3 against me.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
I might have just voted for you, but I know I voted for you, and I'm glad to have met you now for the first time. So thank you for running, no matter what happens on the 6th. You're doing amazing work. My question relates to, because I work with the homeless, so when you're have these small villages, is that what you're calling them? Little small?
I call them community integrated transitional villages.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, so we all know who lives in San Francisco, you don't have to work homeless. So there are many, many diverse issues that they deal with, people who live on the street. How much staff do you need, let's say, in addition to what we have now? How many medical workers or other people do you think you need, and where would they come from? Is it possible you could get them from places like San Francisco State or
Yes.
religious organizations? Or because
Yes.
I feel like a residency program, I saw this in Washington, D.C. They have residency programs at the shelter. So instead of just relying on St. Vincent de Paul Society, where I work, or Episcopal Housing Services, the other shelter system, you know, instead of just, and they're good, they're nonprofits and they have employees, but also have some, not just volunteers, but in between student types, graduate students who are working there, you know, to perhaps provide some more help, services.
It's a great idea, and you're going to be shocked about this, I bet. So in 2015, the city was spending $3 million a year just on DPW, the Department of Public Works, cleaning up encampments. It tripled since then. It's $9 million, so they decided to invest the money in DPW to clean up encampments, right? And then $20.6 million is what the budget and legislative analysts found is what the police department is budgeted to clean up encampments or respond to encampments. So that's $30 million, right? So I've created a program for $9 million, bare bones, and I know how to stretch a budget, believe me, because I work in nonprofits, right? So for $9 million bare bones, we could actually create 20 to 50 of these villages. And the idea is I would like 50 20-person villages, because I think that having smaller amounts of people makes it more easier to fit into a neighborhood. And the design of the program is that it's very similar to the Community Land Trust Board, where it's a third, and a third of the people on the board representing the different stakeholder groups. So you would have a 9-person board. 3 of those people would be nominated from the village, the residents of the village. 3 of those people would be neighbors and business owners, and 3 of those people would be service workers. Because each village has a community integration manager, and that's my role right now in the work that I'm doing. And then I manage and support the property owner, the neighbors, and the residents. And I make sure that's all working together. So that's one role. It's a half-time role to do that management. And then a second role is the resident empowerment organizer. So it's someone that's helping people live together. And guess what? Living together in community, it's challenging. Whether you're in a condo, or whether you're just in group housing, or whether you're in an encampment or a village. So it's a skill set, and we help people with de-escalation skills. And that person is also able to notice, does this person need more structure or support? But the way that we designed it is I got help from Mission Housing Development Corporation to actually create the legal support for the lease. So the property owner signed a lease, the resident, the nonprofit, which is my organization, signs the lease, and so does the village resident. And then it's just like anything else, like an SRO, right? You have your room, you have your lease. Now, what you do behind closed doors, that's your business. But if that business spills out into the rest of the group, then we're gonna talk about it. And that's actually built into the lease. And the third role that we have at these spaces is a part-time transitional and vocational coach. And so there's someone there that's working with you. And the way that we have it designed is that one of the lease agreements is that you will make a good faith effort to work on your transition goals. And so the person that we're working with set their transition goals, and then we've been having some challenges right now recently with the person who's working in the program, because I need her to give me her income certification because we need to take this next step, because we stabilized. She's had 5 months to stay in the village, but at the same time, we need to help her transition. And so she needs that extra support. But those jobs, the $9 million is to build the small shelters that we have and to have the porta potties and the gym memberships in lieu of showers, because these are off-grid triage villages. But part of that money, of course, is the biggest part is going to the jobs.
A few more questions.
Okay, got it. This is probably something you guys are interested, I would imagine, is how this village would actually operate, right? But it's 3 jobs per site that are part-time, and so one person could probably have 2 sites that they're working on in that regard. And we would have hiring that was focused on people who are graduates of CCSF and their community health outreach worker program, and SF State, and CIIS, the same thing that you were talking about. So it's really about connecting the dots. Okay, one more question?
Yeah, one more.
Okay, sure.
Can you speak to your support or thoughts on the proposed Senate Bill 827 from the State Senator Scott Wiener?
Yeah, so that is about increasing the density and the height for around transit areas, and I agree that that's something that we should do. But like I said, I was just at this event yesterday at Spur, and I think that we need to demand that we're building more affordable housing when we build up. And so I think it's entirely possible for us to have 50% affordable from that range of 20 to 120% AMI if we're using the right financing mechanisms, and we can get that support from the state in terms of these state tax credits. So I don't want it to be just the increased density and height. I want us to be really thoughtful and creative about new financing tools in order to do the affordability with it.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, everyone.